guys. So in this day and age of the United States, media exposure is inevitable. All forms of content are virtually available at our fingertips with a simple click of a mouse, which begs the question, is early sexual content exposure damaging our youth? Years and years of research has been conducted on this subject, and it's safe to say that the effects are minimal, if even present at all. My opposition is going to tell you that this exposure to this content leads to early high-risk sex addiction, and sexual violence, but there is little evidence to back that up. First, it's been said that more children are engaging in sex younger as a result of early exposure to sexual content. This sexual content is presumed to be a source of sexual education for the young, which the opposition claims has led to high-risk sex. There is no statistical evidence to back these claims up, when in reality, according to the Guttmacher Report on Public Policy, the exact opposite is true. Since the 80s, there has been a 19% decline in teenage pregnancy, which is the lowest in many years. This trend has This trend has been attributed to teenagers actually abstaining from sex and also using contraception more effectively. So media influence is also not the sole or most direct form of influence in this equation. The most influential factor is the morals and values a child's parents have instilled in them. According to the Heritage Foundation, researchers found that above anything else, a child's connection and extent of communication with their parents is almost directly correlated to whether or not they'll have early sex. If a child has a healthy and stable relationship with their parents, they are much more likely to delay sex. So not only is the rate of teenage sex decreasing, it's the parents who have the most powerful form of influence on their children, not the media. It's also been shown that contraceptive use has exponentially grown since the 80s. So secondly, it's been speculated that pornography contributes to sexual addiction. The only factual evidence reported by the opposition is a reference to a study that claims that men and women that consider themselves to have sex addictions and intimacy disorders find pornography to be a factor in that equation. The study fails to report the significance of this particular factor and when their first exposure to sexual content occurred, which renders the correlation between early exposure to sexual content and sex addiction inconclusive. And unfortunately for the opposition, sex addiction is not even recognized as a disorder by the American Psychiatric Association. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders renders sex addiction void as an official disorder as well. And furthermore, a study conducted at UCLA found that sex addiction is nothing more than a person possessing a high libido, which is primarily determined by an individual's biology. As a result, there is no conclusive correlation between early exposure to sexual content and sex addiction, which is not even recognized as an official disorder, and the symptoms of which stem from a high libido, which is naturally and largely determined by a person's biology. So the final claim is that early exposure to sexual content may increase the risk of a child committing sexual assault. Kuczynski relays that a major study conducted internationally in 1991 discovered this claim to be untrue. 4 different countries were studied over a period of 20 years where pornography and ease of access to it was abundant. Researchers found that the number of sexual crimes did not increase a notable amount, nor did they increase more than the number of non-sexual crimes committed. Therefore, the only reasonable conclusion that can be drawn is that there is no discernible correlation between sexual violence and the consumption of pornography. No research studies or statistical information has been presented to prove otherwise. Now, while the idea of our youth being exposed to sexual content is certainly distasteful, there is no evidence that supports the claim that early consumption of this material will lead to harmful behavior. Thank you. I talk too fast, so I mix up all my words. Yeah. Edible pornography. Doesn't sound healthy, that's for sure.
All right, well, you identified the general issue pretty clearly. Your secondary points are labeled effectively. I don't remember that they all correspond exactly to the advocate's points, but it sounds like they did. On the first argument, you give good evidence to suggest the opposite conclusion. There's a little bit of a challenge to the lack of evidence from the advocate's point of view, and then you dive in with your own information suggesting the conclusions can't really be reached this way. And I thought you had a couple of good tools that you measured that by, the pregnancy rate and the degree to which people are abstaining more frequently. I think that makes sense. And the counter causality, in other words, that the strongest influence is the influence of the relationship with the parents. I thought that was a very effective quote, which seems to suggest that, I think you do make the argument here, and there's nothing wrong with what you said. I think you could just add a little bit to it that says, look, whatever exposure they're likely to have encountered, there's no evidence that shows that comes in any way close to influencing them nearly as much as the relationship with their parents. And that's the bottom line here, that if you've got kids who are unmanaged and they don't have a relationship with their parents, they're going to have problems regardless, whether or not they come into contact with pornography online or in social media. The sex addiction argument I thought was pretty effective at diminishing the stance that the advocate is taking on this. The lack of authoritative recognition of that I thought was okay. The notion that it's all high libido, and I think you do want to come back to this notion that there's no explanation that suggests that there's a link to access to pornography and the libido. It simply says, like, you have a good general challenge at the beginning, but you need to explain what that challenge is. I think everything that you've said in that first part leading up to this argument is perfectly valid, but it's one of those ones that you kind of rush through and you think everybody's going to pick up on it, and I'm not sure that they are going to see it the same way you do. I know what it is you're trying to say there. I just think you need to say that part a little bit more specifically. On the third point, I thought that you had a good explanation of the information. I didn't remember that the advocate had that point. I'd have to look back at their outline, but it certainly sounds like you've got good counterclaim on that particular point. And it's delivered. You didn't go as fast this time. I know. I heard you say when you sat down, "I'm still going too fast." Yeah. You sounded fine. You know, I thought it was pretty clear. Like I said, except for that one section right at the beginning of the second point, where you've got this challenge on the evidence, and there are good reasons to believe those challenges, but you got to slow down and explain them a little bit.
That's what I realized.
All right.
Yeah.